Do you have a grand vision for your life that genuinely excites you and fires you up, but every time it's time to work on it, you just procrastinate and you self-sabotage and you hold yourself back? And when you're trying to put in work toward this big goal, no amount of willpower or productivity hacks or just trying to push through is working for you. And the reason why those solutions don't work is because this isn't fundamentally a willpower problem. Something else entirely is going on. What if I told you that something deeper and far more intelligent is happening underneath the surface when you're holding yourself back when working toward your big goals? And once you know what that reason is, you can actually work with your resistance instead of fighting with your resistance. And that's exactly what I'm going to be teaching you in this video. Now, the real reason why you have a big vision but you're not taking any action is because there's an internal split happening within yourself. And there's one part of you that dreams big, and there's another part of you that resists those dreams. And this internal split within you is a feature and not a bug. And once you learn how to embrace and work with both of these parts of yourself, you can actually get both of them on the same page, moving in the direction of your big goals. So in order to get these two parts of you on the same page, we first have to understand a bit about each of them. And you can almost think about these as like two little people that live inside of you. I almost like to imagine it as two little guys who have like opposite goals to one another, and they're having to come to some kind of agreement. So one of these little guys, or one of these aspects of yourself, is your power aspect. And this is the part of you that is geared toward expanding your power as much as possible. And whenever you're dreaming big and you have these big grand visions of things, your power aspect is in full force. And the main priorities of this power aspect within you is to realize your full potential and to go in the direction of what it is that you really truly want. And so anytime that you're thinking of something where you can impact a lot of people, or you can have more money or more power in some way, this aspect is in charge of that. Now, on the opposite side, your other little guy, or your other aspect that's there, is your responsibility aspect. And the main priorities of your responsibility aspect is to conserve your energy and to prevent a situation where you get crushed under the weight of too much responsibility. And so one thing that's important to know is that these two aspects are two sides to one coin, because power and responsibility are meant to rise and fall together. So if you have low power, you have low responsibility. If you have high power, you have high responsibility. And if there's a break in either direction, what ends up happening is that corruption ensues. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but if you think about it from the perspective of these two aspects, because one is about maximizing power and the other is about minimizing responsibility, they have to be able to meet in the middle somewhere for their dynamic to not be a corrupt dynamic. So when you're fantasizing about your big grand vision that you want to realize, what's happening there is that that's your power aspect trying to expand your power and trying to expand your level of impact. And then when you stop yourself, when you stall out, when you're procrastinating, when you're self-sabotaging, that's your responsibility aspect putting up a stop sign and saying, whoa, that's too much power and too much responsibility. That'll be really heavy. We don't have the structural integrity yet to hold that amount of power. So I'm going to give you a metaphor to understand this more in practice. Let's say that power is represented by a sword, and let's say your responsibility capacity is represented by your core muscles and your strength. And when your power aspect has a big vision that it wants to realize, that's it asking for a bigger sword from your responsibility aspect. And it's your responsibility aspect that actually gives the power aspect that sword. But let's say that you ask for a sword that's giant and you don't yet have the strength to wield that sword gracefully. What's going to happen is the responsibility aspect is going to keep that sword away from you. It's going to stop you from moving forward toward those goals that have to do with this big grand vision, because your muscles aren't built up enough to wield the sword yet with grace. So make sure to take note of this takeaway, because it's really important that whenever you are seeming to hold yourself back or sabotage those goals, it's really your responsibility aspect putting on the brakes, and it's doing this to serve you. And if it wasn't doing this, what would happen is that instead of power and responsibility rising and falling together, you would have a power and responsibility responsibility skew, and that's where corruption comes from. So that part of you that's putting on the brakes is actually saving your integrity when it does that. Now, if all of this is resonating with you so far and you want to learn more about how to overcome procrastination and self-sabotage, I highly recommend checking out my free webinar, 3 Shadow Work Secrets to Get Out of Your Own Way and Reach Your Full Potential Without Having to Fight Yourself. And the link is down below in the description box. And if you would like to work with me one-on-one, I have an application down below in the description box as well. Now, there's a very common quote that says, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And for the longest time, I didn't really understand the mechanics behind why power corrupts. And it also suggests within the quote that not all power corrupts, because if absolute power corrupts absolutely, but power just corrupts, there must be some situations where power does not corrupt. And ultimately, power is really the ability to do what it is that you want to do. So even the ability to walk around or move around is power, or the ability to go to your fridge and get something to eat is power. So for the longest time, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, there was an interpretation in my mind that, oh, power is just this corrupting influence and it needs to be chucked out entirely. But once you understand that power and responsibility are two sides to one coin, and that power and responsibility have to rise and fall together, what we know is that whenever our power overshoots our level of responsibility, what ends up happening is that corruption ensues. We lose structural integrity within ourselves, and we start operating in a way that is unwieldy. And if we have absolute power, no person is capable of absolute responsibility. So it corrupts absolutely. And so that part of you that slams the brakes on your big grand vision and doing work on that is saying, whoa, 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 we need to build our core strength muscles first. We need to build more integrity. We need to build ourselves up. And whenever there are people who end up expanding their power without their responsibility expanding with it, what ends up happening is that they become corrupt individuals and they lose structural integrity in themselves. And it becomes actually very difficult once you've gone out of integrity to bring yourself back into integrity. So that's why this stalling out and not taking action is actually a feature and not a bug. And once you start treating it like a feature, you can actually work with it and you can start to develop those core strength muscles to wield the sword of the power that you're asking for. But it's also understandable that in the interim, it can be very, very frustrating when you have this great vision and you just want to bring it to fruition, but you just keep slamming on the brakes. And I get that that's so frustrating. But if you know the reason, you can actually work with that reason instead of fighting against it. So there's the metaphor with building your core muscles so you can wield a bigger sword, or you can also think about it as, like, let's say a tree that wants to expand its branches out further and wants to produce more fruit. And so what ends up having to happen is that the tree actually has to grow its roots first, right? It has to stretch its roots deeper in the soil. And what happens is if the tree expands the branches and the fruit out to a certain extent without the roots growing with it, again, structural integrity is lost and the tree topples over. And so that's what happens when there's that corruption, when your power overshoots your level of responsibility. Now, sometimes it might happen that you might stumble into power that you didn't expect to have. And when that happens, what often is the case is that you don't have the responsibility muscles yet built up to deal with that level of power. So for example, with my other YouTube channel, The Diamond Net, what ended up happening is I ended up getting like a handful of videos that did really, really well. And I ended up gathering an audience to me. And to me, it was like, I didn't have big goals and dreams with it. At first, I was just, okay, I want to share my insights and maybe like find people that appreciate it. And like my big lofty dream was like, hey, maybe I can make some money with AdSense and replace my 9-to-5 income with it, which I didn't make that much. It was like, okay, maybe I can make $1,500 a month on AdSense and I can quit my job. That was like the extent of the power ask that I was making. But what ended up happening is I ended up gathering quite a large audience to me. And there were so many, like just looking back, so many different mistakes that I made because I just didn't have those like responsibility muscles built up to handle that amount of power. So it was like my branches had expanded beyond my roots a bit. And so I actually had to learn as I went. And like there were certain things that I just wasn't aware of. So I didn't know how to wield the sword optimally. I didn't know how to wield power optimally. So like when I, let's say, was starting my business, for example, which was a few years into my channel, channel already being up and going. It's like I didn't know how to run a business properly. My offers were all over the place and like, just not optimized. I was undercharging. So it's like I wasn't wielding the power effectively. But then I also, like, in terms of the responsibility, there were some things where I wasn't aware of certain vulnerabilities that like people have. And like looking back, I'm like, okay, I wouldn't have done that way, again. So for example, like when I first started out, like, and I hadn't yet found my voice and I didn't know yet how to speak on camera. And I was very stilted, and the way that I wrote it was like, very, very certain, and it came off as a bit like guru-ish and like a little bit like weird because I was like speaking in a stilted way and trying to like almost like read my script word for word. And what ended up happening, and this is when my channel was really small, is it ended up like attracting a bunch of people who were like almost like looking for like a cult leader type of thing. And they were like, oh my gosh, you're like the Buddha times 5,000. And I'm like, oh, nope, I am attracting the wrong audience to myself. And so what I had to do is I actually had to change my voice up, and I had to make sure that I was like coming across more as an every person. Like, hey, I'm on this journey just like you're on this journey. And so in that way, it's like getting used to the habit of like handing power back to other people, which was not a skill that I had going into that. And so basically I've had to build those responsibility muscles as I've gone along, and there's been many mistakes that I've made. So if you ever end up stumbling into power, you also have to build those responsibility muscles to go with it. And that can be really, really challenging to get your roots to catch up to your branches if your branches grow beyond your roots. So ultimately, the main thing that you have to do in order to bring your grand vision to fruition and to actually allow yourself to take steps in that direction is to develop your core muscles for responsibility. Being able to strengthen your responsibility muscles are incredibly important for maintaining integrity with yourself and just being able to allow yourself to move forward in that direction without dealing with incredibly negative consequences internally and externally later on. So I'm going to give you a handful of things to do in order to develop that sense of structural integrity and to grow your responsibility muscles as you make this bigger power ask that your grand vision is. And that way, when your power aspect asks for more power through those visions, your responsibility aspect will give you the green light instead of a red light. So the first thing that you need to do in order to develop the strength of your responsibility aspect and those responsibility muscles, and this is like the most important thing, which is to be well resourced. That means making sure that you have enough in terms of physical resources, but you also want to make sure that you have a strong support system. And if you lack this, it's going to be really difficult to maintain a high level of integrity when you're going about achieving your vision. Because ultimately, if you are, like, let's say, in scarcity and you're lacking in some way and you feel unsafe, you're likely to make decisions from a less integrous place compared to if you have all of your basic needs taken care of. For example, if there's a starving person and it's their responsibility to guard a loaf of bread and to make sure that nobody steals the loaf of bread, it's going to be extra difficult for them to resist stealing the loaf of bread for themselves because they're starving. And so be realistic with yourself and don't expect yourself to take on tons and tons of power and therefore responsibility when you don't have a good foundation in terms of having all of your basic needs met. The next thing that you can do to build those responsibility muscles is to protect your energy. So becoming really aware of whatever it is that drains your energy and cutting those things out of your life. And so that could be something like if you notice yourself engaging in a lot of media content like online or things like that that might pull at your energy. Maybe it makes you angry or it makes you worried or that type of thing and triggers some kind of anxiety. So you want to cut that out. Or if there are people around you that drain you, you're going to have to get some more distance there. Or if you're like constantly on all the time and you don't have any break from, like, let's say being on screens or no breaks from work or whatever it is that happens to drain you, you want to get really aware of those and cut those out. And you want to think about creating for yourself almost like a little glass bubble around yourself so that you can protect your peace and you can protect your energy. Also along these same lines, make sure that you protect your boundaries, which means knowing your boundaries very well and enforcing them, and also getting plenty of rest as well. And you can even think about this as like, let's say you have a cup And you want to make sure that your cup is always overflowing. So you never want to pour from your cup. You actually want to make sure that anything that you give is always in excess of the cup being completely full. So you don't want to even, like if it's halfway full, you don't want to tip it over and pour it out. You only want energy to come out of the cup that's actually in surplus of you. The next thing you can do is to make sure that you're aware of your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities and to caretake those weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Think about it as like, almost like if you were trying to build that structural integrity, but there's these little weak points that you have there. And instead of resisting those weak points, instead you want to give them the TLC that they need to strengthen up. Or there might be some kind of sensitivity to work through there that, like, instead of trying to numb yourself, you actually have to work through the deeper sensitivity. The next thing I recommend is to know your limits. That means knowing what you're capable of doing and what you're not capable of doing, knowing what it is that you're good at and what it is that your weak points are. And so it can be very helpful to think, oh, I can do anything I put my mind to. But the reality is that not everything is going to align with our natural aptitudes or our natural will, the things that we want to do. And so making sure that you're only taking on the things that are, genuine strengths for you. You don't want to be struggling every single day because, again, that's going to waste your energy and waste your resources. And on top of knowing your limits, also important to choose your limits. Say, I prefer to have power and responsibility over this. I don't prefer to have power and responsibility over that. So your power aspect of you is going to want to expand your power as much as possible. It wants and it wants and it wants. But then you also have to check in with your responsibility aspect. Like, do I actually want to take on the burdens of these responsibilities? And if the answer is no, making sure that you say no and that you set those boundaries. And another thing that's really important to do is to attune to yourself before you try to attune to others. So if you have a big grand vision about helping the world or helping other people, but you yourself are in lack, what ends up happening is that it's a little bit like the situation where you're on the airplane and you haven't secured your own mask and you're trying to help other people secure their oxygen mask. And so basically making sure that you secure your own mask first before going to help other people. Again, making sure that you stay well resourced. And think about it like the doctor has to be well. And if you are seeking to help other people with your grand vision, you have to make sure that you are really well taken care of first. And then my final piece of advice here is to try to, as much as possible, get your identity out of your motivation towards your big goal. So if you imagine yourself as oh, I'm going to be this hero and I'm going to leave this legacy and I'm going to come in and I'm going to save the world. Instead, what you want to do is you want to decenter yourself. And particularly if it's something service oriented, you really want to focus on just the either enjoyment of the process of doing it or the enjoyment of the outcomes of doing it. And almost getting to a point where you could, even if you could just push a little red button and then all of a sudden that problem that you're trying to solve would be solved, or the vision that you're trying to bring to fruition would come to fruition, that you would be okay with not being known at all as the person who achieved that or solved that, and fully willing to hand it over to another person if that's the best thing to do. And so basically being able to really operate from a sense of just wanting the outcome in particular or just wanting the process in particular without getting wrapped up with identity motivation and ego motivation. Now, when it comes to developing a good relationship between your power aspect and your responsibility aspect, there's also other elements that are necessary for kind of getting them on the same page and bringing those two parts of yourself together. And if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend checking out this video right here.